All right, I'm starting with a brand new project called PyYelp. In this project, currently I only have one file, that is app.py. Now let's open up the terminal window and using pipenv install the requests package. We use this package to send HTTP requests. Let's go ahead. So this is creating a virtual environment. Our package is installed, beautiful. Now let's change the virtual environment in VS Code to the one that is created for our PyYelp project. Now VS Code is telling us that linter pylint is not installed. So let's go ahead and install this as well. All right, now in app.py, on the top, let's import the requests module. This object has a method called get for sending an HTTP GET request to an endpoint. As I told you before, every HTTP request has a method, and that method determines what we want to use the request for. So GET is for getting data. So here we need to pass the URL or the address of an endpoint. Back to Yelp documentation. Here under Yelp Fusion, let's take a look at business endpoints. Here we have this business search endpoint. That is right here. So you can see we have to send a GET request to this endpoint. I'm going to copy this address and then paste it here. Now this GET method returns a response object. Now let's save the changes. VS Code is telling us that formatter AutoPep8 is not installed in our virtual environment. So let's go ahead and install this as well. All right, now let's print this response. Save the changes and run the program. We got a response with the status 401, which is one of the standard HTTP error codes. So here on Google, if you search for HTTP 401, you can see that 401 represents unauthorized. In this case, we got this error because we didn't tell Yelp who we are. So every time you want to call one of the endpoints of Yelp, we should send our API key to tell Yelp who we are. This is what we call authentication. Now, back on Yelp documentation, here under Yelp Fusion, let's take a look at the introduction document. Under authentication, we have a link to the authentication guide. So this page is telling us that we should first create an app to get an API key. We already done that, beautiful. So next it's telling us to authenticate API calls. We need to set the authorization HTTP header to bearer API key. What is going on here? Well, these HTTP requests have two sections or two components, the header section and the payload section. In the header section, we have a few headers that specify some metadata about this request. These headers are key value pairs. One of these headers is the authorization header, which is defined in the HTTP protocol. We use this header to tell the web server who we are. Let me show you how to do that. So to make this code a little bit cleaner, I'm going to grab this URL and store it in a separate variable. Let's call that URL and then pass that here. Now, this get method optionally takes keyword arguments. One of them is headers. You can read this in the documentation of the requests package on PyPI. We can set this to a dictionary of key value pairs. So for clarity, I'm going to create that dictionary separately. Let's set headers here to a new dictionary. In this dictionary, we're going to have a key called authorization. And we should set this to bearer followed by a space and our API key. So back on Yelp, here let's go to manage app and grab our API key. So copy this. And now let's store that in a separate variable. So API underline key, we set this to this string. Make sure you don't accidentally put a space here. Otherwise, Yelp is going to tell us that it didn't receive a valid API key. So no space here and also no space at the beginning, right? So here's my API key. Now we need to append that here, API key. Finally, we set the headers here, save the changes. Let's run the program one more time. Okay, this time we got a response with a different status code. That is 400. Once again, if you search for HTTP 400, you can see that 400 represents a bad request, which means the server expected some data and we didn't supply that. How do we know what the server expected? Well, this response object has an attribute called text. With that, we can see the details of what the server sent us. So let's run the program one more time. This is a JSON object with a property called error, which is set to another JSON object. Now here the error message says, please specify a location or a latitude and longitude. So back to Yelp, let's look at the documentation for this endpoint. That is under business endpoints. Let's expand this one more time. It's right here, business search. So these are the parameters that we can send to the server. One of them is term, which is optional. Another one is location, which is required. And here are some examples. We can set that to something like New York City or NYC or an address. So we can either send the location or a latitude and longitude. So now let me show you how to pass parameters when sending HTTP requests. This get method of the requests object optionally takes another keyword argument, params. Just like the headers, we set this to a dictionary. So I'm going to define a dictionary here, params, and set the location key to, let's say, New York City. And then we pass this keyword argument here. Save the changes, run the program one more time. Okay, this time we didn't get an error. Instead, we got a JSON object that includes the list of businesses in New York City. Now let's filter this. So in our params object, I also want to set the term to barber. So I only want to see the barbers in New York City. Save the changes and run this one more time. If you scroll to the top, you can see that this JSON object has a property called businesses, and this is set to an array because here we have square brackets. In this array, we have a bunch of JSON objects because we have curly braces. So back to our response object. Now, instead of using the text attribute, I'm going to call the JSON method, and this will convert the result into a dictionary. So we can store that in a variable called result. Now, as you saw, this dictionary has a key called businesses that is set to a list. So we can immediately access this key, businesses, and let's rename this variable to businesses. Now we have a list of dictionaries. Now let's print the businesses variable. So we get a list of dictionaries. Each dictionary has these key value pairs, ID, alias, name, and so on. So this is the name of the business. Now let's say we only want to get the name of these businesses. So we can simply iterate over this list, get each dictionary, and extract the value of the name key. So for business in businesses, we can print business of name. Let's save the changes, run the program one more time. That is better. Now let's take this to the next level. We can use a list comprehension to get the name of businesses that are rated 4.5 stars or higher. So remember list comprehensions? The syntax is like this. Item for item in list. In this case, our list is businesses. Each item is a business, which is a dictionary object. Now to get the name of the business, here we type business of name. So this list comprehension will return the list of these businesses. Now we want to filter. So if business of rating, that's another property that we have in the result. So if the rating is greater than 4.5, then we want to add the name of the business to the list. Finally, we'll store the result in names, and then we can simply print the names variable. Let's run the program one more time. So these are the highest rated barbers in New York City.